Okay, today I'm going to talk about animals as individuals. This is a chapter in your book, so please go and read this chapter because I'm not going to cover everything in detail, and the questions for the question bank, some of them might come from the book and things that I didn't mention. All right, so why do we care about individuals? I hope by the end of this you'll appreciate how important individual variation is, and that's particularly important when we start talking about uh, evolution. So in populations, we basically have adaptations, and this is just a trait that increases fitness relative to another trait. We're going to talk about what fitness is in just a few minutes, but essentially that adaptation is just a trait that performs better than another trait that it replaces. So like if you had brown hair color and blonde hair color, those traits might have some relative fitness advantage for fox squirrels, for instance, where they have multiple hair colors. So in other words, like if you were burning, for instance, and you can imagine in that system things tend to be really dark because of the charcoal that's created by fire, it might be really good in that case to have dark hair for those species. So that'd be an adaptation. Evolution just refers to changes in populations over time. So if you continue to have adaptations and traits continue to be replaced by better traits, then eventually that population changes over time. That would be evolution. So evolution does not imply mechanism. And what I mean by that is evolution isn't actually causing the change in populations. The change in populations is called evolution. So the way that populations are changing through time to cause evolution is through natural selection, or at least that's the primary mechanism that it's attributed to. So natural selection is that survival of the fittest that we were just talking about, where some traits confer a fitness advantage over others, and because of that, you end up with more of those traits in the population, and it continues on and on. And through that survival of the fittest, we see species evolve over time. So the theory of natural selection comes from three basic observations. One is that populations increase geometrically. So this is a geometric relationship that we're talking about. We're going to have a whole module on population dynamics in a couple of weeks. So you'll learn a lot more about this. And of course, for those WEC majors, you have a course that is on population ecology, and you'll get really in depth. This is more of just an overview. But basically, populations increase geometrically. So if like we introduced a species, that's the kind of growth pattern that we would see as it's getting established. And another thing that is very important is that we have individual variation. So if you don't have variation in genetics and traits within populations, there would be no basis for some traits to be better than others, and you wouldn't see any of that selection. And another thing is this last one. So this is a classic carrying capacity curve. So at some point you have this geometric growth to where you reach a carrying capacity. In other words, you reach a level of resources where more individuals can't be sustained in the population, and we tend to see the population stabilize around that carrying capacity, and it changes only when things in the environment change. So that would be populations remain relatively constant around this line, and that's being limited by a lack of resources, right? We don't have enough resources to support a higher population. So the three observations led to two postulates, and these are basically like hypotheses. So one is individuals compete for resources. We know that they may be competing for food or territory or mates. You know, there are a lot of things that can be competed for, just space in general might be one. So there are a lot of resources that could be competed for. We're going to talk about this more in the upcoming lecture on food, water, and cover. But generally, because there's competition for all these things, the best competitors are expected to leave more progeny. So that's that natural selection, that the survival of the fittest, where the best competitors have adaptive traits that are going to perpetuate genes moving into future gene pools, and over time that there continues to be selection for adaptation of those traits. So the replacement of types in this case that produce fewer successful offspring lead us or being replaced, the more successful ones replace the less successful ones over time. That brings us to what we're talking about with fitness. And that's just, fitness is the relative long-term reproductive success of an individual. Okay, so to be completely true about fitness, you would look at not only the offspring being produced by the individual, but how those offspring, whether or not they reach maturity, and then the next generation, how their offspring do, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine how we could continue to better calculate fitness for an individual as we go through more generations through time. That's pretty difficult to do in the wild. And if we were looking at a picture like this, you might immediately think, oh, the one on top produced more young, so that individual is more fit, that mother's more fit than the one on bottom. But let's think about that for a minute. Based on that metric of fitness, based on her reproductive output, based on the information that we have in these pictures, that would be the assumption we made. But if we started thinking a little differently and say, okay, older age ducklings have a much higher survival rate than lower or younger ones, and you can see these are quite a bit older down here than those, it could be very well that if there's a 99% death rate of ducklings that size, she may have actually been more fit in this case. In truth, in the wild, neither of those would be an actual measure of fitness. They are a proxy for fitness. We often have to use proxies in nature to approximate what we think fitness is, or what we think is the best management strategy. But in truth, without measuring this over many generations, we may not have a very good approximation of what true fitness is. So I just wanted to give you that example. Just having more isn't necessarily better, right? The other thing we're not taking into consideration is both of these females can reproduce for many years, right? So there may be multiple years of ducklings that have been contributed over time, and that would all contribute to that individual's fitness. So it's a little bit tricky to calculate, and we most of the time have to use some metric like reproductive rate or survival rate or something like that to approximate what fitness is. And we'll talk about that more in population dynamics. So it's basically fitness is the comparison of reproductive rates and survival rates between types. So those two individual ducks that we just talked about have different traits associated with them. They're obviously very similar. They're the same species, same age, same sex. A lot of things are similar, but they also have some traits that allow for selection to occur. We use a lot of indicators, and the ones in the reproductive rates, survival rates, those are the best direct indicators. The indirect indicators might be something like body size. So morphological traits, it's pretty common that we'll take blood from animals. So we might get some physiological indicators that indicate how healthy or how fit an individual is. There also may be some behavioral things, and what I'm talking about is with a lot of ungulates or cervids in particular, a lot of them defend territory, for instance. So we might be able to assess or get a relatively good indicator of individual fitness based on how well the individual establishes a territory. So lots of different kinds of indicators that we use. We might use fat reserves, for instance. There are a lot of good ones, and they talk about a bunch in the book. So make sure you look at that section. But I wanted you to get a good idea of how we might measure this kind of thing in the wild. So I wanted to go through the corollaries of natural selection. I'm going to go through the 6 of them, and they talk about these a little more in detail in the book chapter, and some other things I'm not going to cover as much, but I thought it was important to cover these things. One, the first corollary is that natural selection results in adaptation to the environment because the types leave more progeny and then are by definition surviving and reproducing in that environment better, right? So the ones with adaptations are reproducing better in the particular environment. Something that's pretty important for you to understand is the environment might change and the relative fitness value of a trait does change over time when the environment is changing. So think about that. So this is basically establishing the way in which we determine which animals are most fit and what resources are most important. You know, this plays into a lot of the strategies that we are using in our management of wildlife, and it's a pretty important thing that I think is often poorly understood in our field, and we should definitely take time to understand better. Adaptations are pretty critical to understand and use during restoration or management efforts. So just to give you some examples, basically what we're talking about with these adaptations are life history traits. And if you think of something like the gopher tortoise, the entire range of that species is occurring in this yellow. So there's a few things that I wanted to point out to you. One, this is an animal that burrows, right? It needs really sandy soil. Notice that it basically doesn't occur anywhere outside of the sandy southern coastal plain, right? That's based on some of its life history traits for where, you know, it has decided to burrow to reproduce and thermoregulate, and you know, that's just an adaptation, a strong adaptation of that species. It has suites of adaptations to be able to burrow. So for instance, those claws and the structure of its limbs, all of those things are playing in to that really important behavior for this species. And I will add also, this isn't considered an ecosystem engineer. We're going to talk about that more, but it's basically creating a habitat component in the environment that's also really important for other species that use those burrows. There are some species, actually some commensals, that are absolutely, they must have gopher tortoise burrows or they go away as well. So this is one of those umbrella species, keystone, you know, species that is ecosystem engineering and has a huge effect on the community around it. Another really important thing is that natural selection does not and cannot produce perfect adaptation. So what I mean by that is natural selection is acting on what genes are available in the population. And if there may not necessarily be good genes. So think about if we had a catastrophic change in the environment, for instance, there may not be the genes in that population to select for the optimal adaptation. So that's something very important. The other thing is the environment is always changing. So there isn't an adaptation that will always be perfect. I put the picture of the panda in there because they're such a great example of this. Let's see, I think I have some, no, I don't have that other slide. So the panda is one of the most inefficient foragers on the planet. So you probably all know that they are a bear species, and most bears eat flesh, and a lot of them are omnivores where they're eating fruits and plant parts and all sorts of things, right? This one almost exclusively eats one thing, so it's bamboo, and you probably already know that. So they're exclusively eating that, and it's not very palatable, and their digestive tract is really poorly adapted to extract nutrients from it. This is a really good example of, they were already genetically constrained with their population to have a digestive tract that doesn't perform very well in that system. And over time, we might see strong selection against that trait, but this is a great example of where they don't have the best digestive tract for what the foods are that are available to them. That kind of leads us into this next corollary. Natural selection cannot anticipate what future conditions are going to be like, right? It's acting on the present and the past to produce adaptive traits that will perform best from what, and I'm saying this like it's a directed manner. It's just a process that's happening, right? There's not like it doesn't have necessarily a direction, but whichever individuals are fittest, they pass on their genetics, and those are the ones that get perpetuated in the environment. And that's based on the current selections on the current and previous traits that are available. Okay, so it's completely acting on those. If the future environment abruptly changes, natural selection may produce a maladaptation. In that case, if we have a trait that was formerly adaptive and it automatically immediately turns maladaptive, that'd be called an evolutionary trap. Okay, so a trait that was formerly adaptive but suddenly becomes maladaptive, that would be called an evolutionary trap. Let me give you a good example of this. So we have windows on the side of buildings that actually reflect light pretty similar to streams. So it's a particular type of grass. And when we have these big hatches in some streams, we'll actually have insects that lay their eggs in the water on that surface. They'll actually lay them on the side of buildings on those windows, where basically the progeny or the eggs have absolutely no chance of survival, because the cue for them to know where to lay their eggs is the reflective characteristics of the water. It doesn't even matter that the window is vertical and water is never vertical, right? The cue has always been relatively good in the environment, and all of a sudden, really quickly, the environment changed, and now that's a maladaptive trait. That is an evolutionary trap. So the fourth corollary of natural selection is that natural selection always acts, or it only acts on inheritable components of an individual. So you may have some traits that aren't genetically inheritable. So in other words, there isn't a trait that you can pass on to to future generations. So natural selection is not acting on that. The fifth corollary would be that favorable genes can produce both favorable and unfavorable effects. So there are a couple of ways that this might happen, but what we're really talking about is net fitness, right? And we have, just tons and tons of different genes. So whatever approximate the net greatest of fitness, is what's going to be selected for. And that could include traits that are good and bad. So if you have pleiotropy, for instance, you might have a trait that's conferring a fitness advantage for one reason, but that same gene affects several other characteristics. So when you have pleiotropy like that, what you would get is whichever one is actually resulting in the net greatest fitness would get selected for, even though it might have some unfavorable characteristics as well. Another case could be polygenic, and that's when there are many genes or more than one gene that's affecting a single characteristic. And you might actually bring along genes that are unfavorable or have unfavorable effects because that gene is responsible for a lot of different things, or because of more than one gene is responsible for some one thing. So that's something important for you to think about. And all that matters really is that we have a net benefit. So the benefits outweigh the detriment. This one is one of the hardest things for a lot of people to understand, and I hope that you understand this, and hope that the book will help you with some of their examples. But natural selection does not guard against extinction. based on the other couple of lectures and the discussions, I hope this has been imprinted on you pretty well. You know, extinction of species is something that commonly occurs, whether humans are involved or not. There's always a background rate of extinction. It happens that right now we're about 10,000 times the rate of background extinction, which is why some are calling the era that we're in the sixth mass extinction, because it's very similar. There's actually a book on this called The Sixth Mass Extinction. Really great read. I've read it a couple of times. If you're interested in that kind of thing and want to understand where they're coming from, it's really good and science-based. So I'd recommend reading that if you're interested. But the important thing for you is, regardless, the environment is always changing, and sometimes natural selection selects species into a corner, right? So they may select for a very specific environment, and then that environment changes, and that species could go extinct as a result. Natural selection is absolutely not guarding against that extinction. Some pretty good examples, again, they talk about it in that book that I mentioned for you to read for fun. There are a bunch of examples near the equator where you have tropical species, and there's been such intense selection that's happened so quickly and for so long, because the equator was free of ice even during the ice ages. So we've had selection for so long and so intense that there's been a lot of speciation and a lot of specialization. And there are some tree species, for instance, that only occur in just like a 3 or 4 foot elevation change on the side of mountains, right? So we're talking about an extremely narrow niche that species is filling. So there's a lot of cool examples like that. You can imagine just a slight fluctuation in temperature in that case could cause that species to go extinct if it happens too quickly for natural selection to favor traits that allow them to adapt. That's the trick. So the effects of history are really important. Animals are always being selected for as the environment's changing. If it changes really rapidly, we end up with that evolutionary trap situation, and that might be a case where you have an extinction. You could also have extinctions by species changing over time and then replacing the less adapted version of the species. So that's basically replacement. But the important thing is all the species are limited by the evolutionary pathway that they've gone down, like what we were talking about with the panda. You can't select to pass on traits that aren't present in the pool. So here's the example with the panda again. You can look really closely at how they have broken out. In here you can see the giant panda is kind of broken out on its own thing right there. It's most closely related to the spectacled bear, but yeah, they've kind of broken out on their own, and they do not have a digestive structure that deals with lignous plants. So plants like what they primarily eat is extremely high in lignin, and we have herbivores that are very well adapted with multi-chambered stomachs and all these adaptations to eat plant material and lignin. And here we have this panda whose stomach is more similar to carnivores, right? And trying to eat that same diet. It's just extremely inefficient. There's some cool stuff on YouTube about this if you want to look more into that. I find a lot of the students in this program are really interested in panda research and conservation. So there's a lot of cool stuff on them, but they are pretty inefficient. Some of the reasons that we've had these differing things, one we used to have a centralized landmass. They talk about this a lot, but when those things broke up, we ended up with some of these geographical constraints when the continents broke apart. And it explains a lot about some of these species. So we have similar species in different continents, and some of that's explained. For instance, we have marsupials and ratites, which are very similar and on very different places in the world. Another thing that has really influenced the species distributions on Earth are people, and you can see kind of how people migrated through all the land masses. And there's kind of two competing schools of thought, and there's probably some level of truth to both of them, honestly. But one is that the arrival of people, because we were hunting and changing habitat, that we ultimately caused the extinction of a lot of large birds and mammals. And there's a lot of truth to that. And some of the best evidence actually indicates that quite a few species, this is probably the major contributor to their extinction. The alternative to that is that a lot of species went extinct because the climate changed so rapidly that the traits that were in the populations did not have time to change. To allow the animals to adapt. And a lot of data showing that the extinctions are probably more related to people showing up than they were to climate for most species. But again, some species like the Irish elk, there's very strong evidence that that was actually a climate-induced extinction. So when we have this isolation that's happening, we have genetic divergence in species, and we're basically talking about, like elk and red deer, for instance, are really good. Once you break that gene flow between the populations and they have their different environments, you start to perpetuate different genes in those populations, and we end up with genetic divergence as a result. Some pretty cool examples of ring species have happened where basically we're talking about a species, migrates around the world, and you may start in one place and start to migrate through, and these populations may be connected, but by the time they converge on the planet again, they actually are different species by then. The greenish warblers are a good example, blackback gull and herring gull, another good one. So their distributions are nearly continuous around the planet, but where they meet again, they actually don't interbreed because there's been so much genetic divergence in the populations. There are a lot of salamanders. Here's a pretty cool figure kind of showing you when they meet again, they won't interbreed. So genetic divergence by this mechanism is pretty important. So there's also allopatric and sympatric. So basically populations might be isolated by geographic barriers, and that's allopatric genetic divergence. Sympatric would be the opposite. Really good examples in the book about this. So make sure you go read the book chapter, and I'm going to try to add the food, water, and cover lecture pretty quick today so that you have that to go on, and then we'll build on that for the discussion. But make sure you check out the book chapter for this week. Appreciate it.